Good morning. Good morning. So here's a question for you. Is it easier for you to host guests or to be a guest? Would you rather stay the night at someone else's house or have them over to your house to stay the night? Does it change for dinner? Do you like to host people for dinner or be hosted? Why? And does it change if it's just a cup of tea or coffee? So I was born awkward. So I feel terribly awkward either way, right? I always am a little nervous. What am I supposed to do? And more importantly, what am I supposed to not do? Do you strip the bed when you leave someone's house, or do you just make it? And how do I show gratitude without being too quirky? So Benedictine spirituality has a focus on hospitality. It is one of the core principles of the Benedictine way of living. It's important, and I am trying very hard to learn it. So we're going to begin with our scene from Luke today, right? 70 followers of Jesus gather. They're eager, and they're probably a little unsure of what to expect next. Jesus pairs them off and gives them, some brief instructions. Travel light. Go find houses and stay in them, in strangers' houses. Speak peace when you enter a house and eat whatever is placed before you. Cure the sick if they're within your reach, and say that the kingdom of God has come near. And that's it. That's the whole plan. There's no budget, there's no printed material, there's just, and there you go. And they head out, completely dependent. They'll rely on open doors and honest welcome. If a village refused them, they move on with the same peace that they offered at the start. And you can imagine this first knock, right? The messengers, they're just covered in dust. They've probably worn their sandals bare. They likely have been nursing their hunger for the last several miles. And they look at each other, and they're like, all right, here we go. And they knock the door. And the door opens, maybe just a wee bit, and a face peering through the cracked door decides in an instant whether these strangers may enter. The visitors, that moment, have no proof that they offer any value at all. The visitors made their choice by knocking, and the host now has to decide if they will open the door. And if you're like me, I have a Ring camera, and so I can see who's there. I'm gonna have to work on some of this. So hospitality stands right at that meeting point. And we can watch hospitality change destinies all the way through Scripture. So in Genesis 18, we see Abraham, right? He sits at the entrance of this tent during the heat of the day, and he sees 3 travelers starting to approach towards him. They're strangers in the desert. But Abraham, he runs to meet them, and he bows low. He fetches water for their dusty feet and orders bread to be baked and selects a tender calf for a meal. Only after he serves do the visitors reveal the promise that within a year, Sarah will cradle a son. The future of Israel begins at that table under the oaks of Mamre. You can turn to Joshua 2 and you see Rahab, a woman of Jericho who shelters 2 of the Israelite spies on her rooftop beneath stalks of dying flax. Soldiers bang on her door, yet she risks her life by hiding the soldiers and sending the pursuers in the opposite direction. And Rahab's small apartment became a sanctuary. And because she opens that space, her family is spared when the walls of Jericho fall, and she's woven into Israel's story as an ancestor of David. And then we're going to go one more. 1 Kings 17. Elijah reaches out to Zarephath during a severe famine, and he asks this widow for water and just this morsel of bread. And she only had a handful of flour and just a little bit of oil, maybe enough for one more meal with her son. But she decides to serve the stranger first. And her jar never runs empty. And later, Elijah calls her child back from death. So the guest receives food, and the host received life. In each scene, energy flows in both directions. Abraham's table brings the promise of Isaac. Rahab's roof secures her future. The widow's obedience keeps her household alive. So hospitality is not charity. It's not charity that's offered downward. It's a meeting ground where God releases blessing to guest and host alike. We see the pattern again in the New Testament over and over again. And St. Benedict understood the weight of this exchange. In chapter 53 of the Rule, he speaks with directness and says, "Receive every guest as Christ." He does not call it an ideal, he calls it the standard. The guest is offered water for tired feet, a meal without delay, and a prayer that includes a psalm. The abbot will greet in person, if available, and monks, no matter what they're doing, interrupt their routine because the stranger carries Christ. Benedict is clear in the Rule that the guest might arrive at an inconvenient hour, and the interruption remains holy. So most of us, I would say all of us, live far from cloistered walls. We juggle children and work emails and house repairs. We experience hospitality as an occasional event, right? It's a holiday meal or a summer barbecue. Yet the pressure on our attention is so great right now. If we do not make a practice of welcome, we will slide into our self-curated bubbles and miss the fragile entrance of grace that hospitality offers. So the first resistance to hospitality often hides behind the phrase, "I'm just too busy," right? It's a calendar full of tasks that seem to deny room for slow conversation. And when we learn to pause, we can discover pockets that can hold another human story. A 10-minute silence at night shows how much noise we usually allow, and a single psalm read before dawn can show how quickly our soul can orient. And these lessons create the margin that hospitality needs. So the second resistance emerges as anxiety over preparedness. The table feels too small, and the menu is just not very impressive. The living room carries the honest mess of life. But the Rule addresses this fear in a really real way. Benedict says nothing about china, nothing about centerpieces. He focuses on the posture of heart and the clarity of purpose. The guest needs warmth. The guest doesn't need china, right? Warmth grows from attention. It is never from decoration. So we're going to try and step into this practice this week. We've got the light track and the heavier track. The light track invites us to do just one specific act. So sometime before next Sunday, meet a person you don't see very often. A neighbor down the road, a colleague outside of your department, and choose a public space, right, if home feels like too large of a hurdle. But grab 2 cups of coffee and just sit. And the rule for conversation is simple. Listen with your whole face. When the other finishes a thought, allow a breath before you respond. And that space tells the speaker that you're not thinking ahead about what you're going to say next or what great advice you're going to offer. It says the story has weight and deserves rest. At the close, offer a blessing. You can speak it out loud, or you can just say it as a whisper in your heart and just lift that person into God's care. If this feels very familiar and you're like, I do that all the time, then consider going one deeper and invite someone or a whole household over that you rarely host to come over and just share a meal. Keep the food ordinary. I mean, like pasta works fine. Soup is great. You know, greet them at the door with the words, "You're welcome. You're welcome here." And when everyone is seated, name Christ as present. You know, a single sentence is enough. And again, it can be just quiet in your heart, you know. And then eat and let the meal last. Ask questions that draw out memory. What place feels like home and why? You know, hear their story. And then listen. And when the plates are empty, thank God aloud for the evening. Dishes can wait till later. And these steps, they sound really plain. They are plain. And that is their strength. Hospitality rises on consistency. The kingdom moves in daily bread, right? We don't need fancy. Our task is to give daily bread a clear path. And when we walk these steps, certain discoveries arise. We realize that conversation has rhythms like music. Silence can be a real note, not an error. We learn our urge to fill space often masks our discomfort with our own hearts. And we see that receiving generosity can actually feel harder than giving it. And we find the guests offer unexpected teaching. A story about surviving a job loss seeds our own courage. A recipe for lentil stew or barbecued ribs solves tomorrow's dinner puzzle. Gifts flow both directions across the table. And then there's also a deeper shift that happens beneath these observations. Hospitality actually touches on the mystery of incarnation. Right? God does not redeem the world from a distance. God moves into the neighborhood and eats with tax collectors and fishermen. When we open a door or we accept an open door, we extend that movement. We act out the belief that divine grace chooses human company. Our living room and our cafes become small Bethlehems where God's presence takes on a local shape. And at this point, someone may ask, isn't this really just good manners? And manners help, but I think hospitality is much deeper. Manners can function even when we really guard our heart. So we can have people at our table and guard our heart, have good manners, but not be showing real, true hospitality, right? So hospitality dismantles the walls, and it allows both the guests and the host to stand on this shared holy ground. It honors vulnerability as sacred and not just weak. So another question surfaces. What if my invitation is refused? And Luke addresses that reality, right? The 70 didn't enjoy universal welcome. The response Jesus gives is calm. Bless the house that accepts you and move on from the house that does not. The kingdom does not depend on universal approval. Faithfulness lies in the offer. And then the final question is, how does this connect to intentional living? So intentional living asks each action to align with divine purpose, and hospitality creates a tangible alignment. Time shifts from self-preservation to shared life. Attention moves from inward monitoring to outward care, and the pattern teaches the soul to value people over output. So I'll close with just a brief story. A member of my last parish, she had lost her spouse a couple of years prior, and after the funeral, like right after somebody dies, everybody calls, right? You have more calls, more cards, more flowers than you know what to do with. But then over time, that all stops, and you find yourself alone. And she was a little older. She, particularly did not like the evenings, and found them very difficult. And a neighbor came and knocked on her door with 2 cups of hot cocoa, unannounced, and they just sat on the porch. There was really no agenda. They just had 10 minutes of silence interrupted by, small sentences and just very small talk. And the neighbor ended with, peace for your night. The widow later was talking to me, and she said that porch visit broke this long wall of solitude in her life. She began to greet mail carriers and dog walkers again. This one simple visit returned her to community. And hospitality seldom records in headlines, but its impact can prove really immense. So the invitation stands. Pick the light or the deep track this week, but place it on the calendar. And I'm going to make this commitment too. So we moved into this new neighborhood last year in North Bend. We moved from Snoqualmie to North Bend. And our neighbors are great, and we live in a great neighborhood, but we don't really know them beyond just kind of this wave here and there. And while we were away in Mexico, one of our dogs kept escaping from our yard. Never had done that while we were home, but waited till we were in Mexico, and this one dog just keeps getting out over and over. And the neighbors from across the street were so great, they kept collecting the dog more than one time. And we would see it on, again, our cameras. On my phone, I could see the dog running and the neighbor running, and they were very persistent. And when we got back, we noticed that they'd even put some rocks and pavers over the hole that the dog was using to get out. And we were really thankful, for their kindness. So we bought them this nice little thank you gift from Mexico. But rather than following the lesson of this sermon, we ran the bag over with a note and stuck it in their front door. So as I was writing this, I kept thinking how I had shortchanged hospitality, in that I hid from an encounter. So this week, I commit to go and to thank that neighbor in person and create some shared space. I'll show up with my whole self. And I love to meet people and I love to hear their stories. And it's super easy to do when I'm the priest, right? It is much harder to do when I am the neighbor. But I do want to live an intentional life. And I believe that Benedict set out principles for very holy living. And I want to live them. So this week, I will. And I hope that you will too. I hope you'll join in this commitment. Put it on the calendar. Pray once for the meeting each day until it occurs. Arrive on time and just trust God with the outcome. May Christ meet you at every threshold this week.